Hello, I'm John Garth. I'm the author of Tolkien and the Great War, a book that won the Mythopoeic Award for Scholarship in Inkling Studies. I'm also the author of The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, published in the UK by Francis Lincoln and in the US by Princeton University Press. And both of those books have been translated into multiple languages. I've contributed to various other books, including this, the latest, a volume in memory of Christopher Tolkien, Tolkien's son. And I've also written a book called Tolkien at Exeter College, which is published by Exeter College, Oxford, focuses on his undergraduate life and is available from my website. I studied English at Oxford University and then went on to a career in journalism. I'm now a freelance editor, writer, and speaker. And today I'm here to talk about Tolkien's life. A tree can only grow in the soil where it is rooted and must weather whatever comes, whether sunshine or rainstorm or gale. We cannot decide what times we are born into, as Gandalf says to Frodo. All we have to do is decide what to do with the time that is given us. Tolkien sometimes objected to personal biography, saying he doubted its relevance to criticism. This tended to happen when he was asked for details by a stranger. Privately, he acknowledged the influence of his times on his own writing, especially times of terrible stress, anxiety, discomfort, and fear. To a fellow author, the poet W.H. Auden, he described himself in 1955 as someone whose instinct is to cloak such self-knowledge as he has and such criticisms of life as he knows it under mythical and legendary dress. To his own son, Christopher, oppressed by military service during the Second World War, he recalled beginning what became the Silmarillion during the First World War to express his feeling about good, evil, fair, foul in some way, to rationalize it and prevent it just festering. Biography can usefully tell us not only about incidents, interactions, and itineraries in the course of a writer's life, but also about contexts, backgrounds. We are all subject to such influences, probably much more than we could possibly know, unless we could look back on our lives objectively after death. That is what judicious biography can do. It should help us appreciate the author's conscious craft, but also the personal, cultural, and historical factors that may have influenced the writing. What follows is very loosely based on a chapter I wrote for the Blackwell Companion to J.R.R. Tolkien, edited by Stuart Lee. But here I'll talk more about Tolkien's formative experiences with more examples and more about the backgrounds that influenced him. More breadth and detail, especially on his academic expertise and medieval influences, about his minor works and about his later life, you can also check out my chapter in the Blackwell Companion. Tolkien's paternal ancestors were thought to come from Saxony in what is now Germany, though recent research links them with East Prussian areas, now in Poland or Russia. Tolkien was interested in the original German meaning of his surname, dull, sharp, or foolhardy. On the Pelennor fields, you can see an echo of the story that one particularly foolhardy ancestor captured the standard of the invading Turks at the siege of Vienna in 1529. The Tolkiens, transported much later to London and Birmingham in England, ran a successful piano-making business, though that didn't rub off on the man himself. "I love music, but have no aptitude for it," he said. In childhood, he failed to learn the fiddle, and so he thought anyone who could play a stringed instrument a wizard worthy of deepest respect. But how about this for wizardry? Tolkien thought he had inherited from his maternal ancestors, the Suffields of the rural English West Midlands, the ability to understand the language spoken there 500 years earlier. "I am a West Midlander by blood," he said, and took to early West Midland Middle English as a known tongue as soon as I set eyes on it. Tolkien's father, Arthur, a banker, left economically depressed Britain in 1889 for southern Africa, where there was a diamond rush. Tolkien's mother, Mabel, followed, marrying and settling with Arthur in Bloemfontein, capital of the Orange Free State. Mabel confidently thought their first child was going to be a girl and picked the name Rosalind. So when on the 3rd of January 1892 a boy turned up instead, he was called the nearest thing, Ronald. In full, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Baby does look such a fairy when he's very much dressed up in white frills and white shoes, his mother said. When he's very much undressed, I think he looks more of an elf still. Tiny, pretty elves and fairies were hugely popular in this era, though when this particular little elf grew up, he came to detest them. In one other way, Ronald set out in life as he would go on. He was prone to bouts of illness. His health suffered in the arid, torrid climate of Bloemfontein. So Mabel brought him and his younger brother Hilary back to England for an extended stay with her parents outside Birmingham. The long steamship voyage in spring of 1985 left 3-year-old Ronald with some of his earliest memories, and brief stops at Madeira and Tenerife may help to account for his fascination with lonely mountain islands. The trip also gave Ronald his first formative taste of permanent loss. His father died of rheumatic fever in early 1896, and he never returned to Africa. But by contrast to the dry prairie or veldt around Bloemfontein, their new home in the village of Sarehole sealed Ronald's particular love of central Midlands English countryside based on good water, stones and elm trees and small, quiet rivers, he said. The family had inherited some money but had to live frugally. His mother taught him drawing, calligraphy, botany, French and Latin, finding him quick to learn. He was stirred when he heard the story of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, retold from Old Norse. He was not yet especially attracted to fairy stories, but all the same he made up stories with ogres and witches inspired by the people of Sarehole. I lived, he later wrote, in a cottage at the edge of a really rural country, on the borders of a land and time more like the lands and hills of the most primitive and wildest stories. It became the ultimate inspiration for the Shire, one influence he was proud to admit. In 1900, after Ronald won a place at a prestigious school, the family had inherited some money but had to live frugally. His mother taught him drawing, calligraphy, botany, French and Latin, finding him quick to learn. He was stirred when he heard the story of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer retold from Old Norse. He was not yet especially attracted to fairy stories, but all the same he made up stories with ogres and witches inspired by the people of Sarehole. I lived, he later wrote, in a cottage at the edge of a really rural country, on the borders of a land and time more like the lands and hills of the most primitive and wildest stories. It became the ultimate inspiration for the Shire, one influence he was proud to admit. In 1900, after Ronald won a place at a prestigious school, the family had to move into the suburbs of nearby Birmingham. The city had its compensations. It was a buzzing home of thousands of artisan craftsmen and a centre of the arts and crafts movement set up in reaction against the mass-produced furnishings and architecture of the 19th century. King Edward's itself was a gorgeous neo-Gothic edifice built by the man who created London's Houses of Parliament. All these things shaped Tolkien's reverence for the craft of skillful hands, beautiful and decorative rather than grimly utilitarian. But parts of Birmingham were impoverished, and beyond lay the heartland of the 18th century Industrial Revolution, a polluted landscape of factories and regimented housing. That region was called the Black Country, the same name that Tolkien later gave to the realm of Sauron. Amid a life of upheaval, Mabel found solace in Catholicism and took her sons into the faith. Catholics, discriminated against by the law up to 1829, were still the targets of deep prejudice. The wider family were horrified by Mabel's conversion, and an uncle stopped paying Ronald's school fees. But 2 years later, in 1903, he won scholarship funds to go back to King Edward's. The second calamity of his life, disrupting his schooling and much more, came in 1904 when his mother died from illness brought on by diabetes. Her death, at just 34 years old, left him with an imperishable ideal of her. He remained a staunch Catholic and believed that she had died a persecuted martyr, to bring her sons to the faith. The Catholic connection deepened as Mabel had entrusted the boys to the legal guardianship of Father Francis Morgan of the Oratory, a community of priests in Birmingham. He found them lodgings near the Oratory, gave them duties serving Mass in its church, helped support them financially, and took them on seaside holidays. Father Francis was strict, but his flamboyance and his taste for simple humour seemed to have rubbed off on Tolkien. For a boy who was now prey to bouts of grief and depression, and whose hobbies were often solitary, that was a real and lasting gift. King Edward's was the kind of school, probably non-existent today, where boys would put on plays in classical Greek and hold debates in Latin. This classical schooling awakened Tolkien's taste for poetry and for the epics of Homer and Virgil about the siege of Troy and its aftermaths. His English teacher introduced the class to 14th century Middle English, prompting Tolkien to begin learning in his spare time Old English, the language of Anglo-Saxon England before the Norman invasion of 1066, as well as Old Norse, one of its cousins. He was fascinated by comparative philology, the science that had enabled these medieval literatures to be read at all in the modern day. Languages change through time. Philology revealed that these changes follow surprisingly strict rules, and that these laws, so-called, could even be used to reconstruct older languages that had never been written down, such as the common Germanic ancestor of Old English and Old Norse. Finding a grammar of the long-extinct Gothic language, Tolkien used the laws of sound change to reconstruct missing Gothic words. This enabled him, during one Latin debate at school, to pretend he was a German envoy and to speak Gothic. A bold piece of one-upmanship, though probably lost on most of his schoolfellows. Alongside learning about languages, he invented his own, the hobby that would determine the course of his creative life. He later kidded himself that it was a common pastime, but that seems a stretch. Still, he'd been born in an era of widespread interest in artificial languages as practical tools for international communication, languages such as Esperanto. The closest Tolkien's own attempts came to plain utility was in two languages concocted with his cousins. Animalic, where dog, nightingale, woodpecker, 40 meant you are an ass, and Nevbosh, or new nonsense, in which they could write funny limericks. With his private inventions, Tolkien wanted to create something quite different to these. Languages that seemed real. They should have authentic flavours, like one of his earliest, which captured Greekness by borrowing the sounds of Greek. As he grew more ambitious, he felt they should have their own histories, like real languages do. Tolkien's personal life took a fateful turn in 1908 when he met a lonely fellow lodger, Edith Bratt. Educated at a specialist music school, she was 3 years older and Anglican, Church of England. Nonetheless, they fell in love. Then Father Francis, fearing that all this would distract Tolkien from school, made the classic mistake of forbidding the relationship. Father Francis was right about distraction, but his ban probably backfired. Tolkien failed his first attempt at the entrance exam for Oxford University that December, and he and Edith predictably stuck together. When Father Francis discovered this in 1910, he went for the nuclear option. He moved Tolkien and his brothers to new lodgings, and he banned any form of contact with Edith. Tolkien was still only 18, which meant he had 3 years to go before he was legally an adult, free to act outside his guardian's authority. Edith moved away to another town. Besides learning or making languages, Tolkien now wrote poetry which, for the first time, shows an interest in fairies. Quite a mainstream theme in this, the era of Peter Pan, the play by J.M. Barrie, which Tolkien saw that spring. In his final months at King Edward's, the school magazine printed the first Tolkien poem ever published, The Battle of the Eastern Field. The title sounds as if he really hit his epic stride already, but in fact this was a parody. What he describes as if it were a heroic clash between Roman soldiers is actually just a school rugby match. For all his nerdiness, Tolkien was also an entertainer, a splendid mimic with a comedic knack. One talent, which he practiced it into middle age, was a party trick of falling downstairs. Playing rugby led to a vital bond with a boy called Christopher Wiseman. Brilliant, unconventional, hilarious. Together with other friends, in Tolkien's final years at King Edward's, they dominated the school's debating, literary and dramatic societies, its whole cultural life. As school librarians, they used their office to brew tea. It was a deadly secret. Not particularly daring, you might think, until he realised that in this era before electric hobs and kettles, they must have used a science lab Bunsen burner. When not putting the library and school at risk of a raging inferno, they would drink tea less surreptitiously at Barrow's, the local department store. So they were the Tea Club and Barrovian Society, or TCBS. Leaving school in 1911, Tolkien joined an aunt and other relatives for several weeks travelling on foot through the Swiss Alps. He never had another experience remotely like this long trek as part of a group, as he put it, about the same size as the company in The Hobbit. Stark peaks, glacial wastes, white waterfalls, cloven valleys. This was one of the key landscapes that first persuaded the romantic thinkers a century and more earlier that mountains were to be revered rather than simply feared. Tolkien later drew upon its incidents and scenery in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, though it is only by good fortune that he even survived to write those books. He recalled, "We were nearly annihilated when strung out on a narrow path with a long snow slope to the right, down which boulders came thundering through our line. One of at least a ton missed me by a foot." Tolkien had won a place on his second attempt at Oxford and enrolled there at Exeter College in the autumn of 1911. He was going to study classics, which, bizarre as it might seem now, is what anyone with a talent for languages did in those days, and was also a passport to all kinds of top-flight careers. But Tolkien was already over-familiar with Greek and Latin literature, and was bored. "Very lazy," the college sub-rector noted in Tolkien's file. He busied himself forming student clubs that tried to replicate the TCBS, playing rugby, and riding with a volunteer cavalry regiment, an obligation that he did not in fact enjoy. The hardest he worked was trying to learn the Finnish language from a book he had discovered in the college library. Tolkien was in love again, in love with this language that he compared to an amazing wine of a kind and flavour never tasted before. He should have given up. He should have prepared instead for the mid-course classics exams that were now looming. And anyway, Finnish was too tough a linguistic nut to crack, even for Tolkien. "I made a wild assault on the stronghold of the original language," he recalled, and was repulsed at first with heavy losses. At the start of 1913, he reached adulthood at last. Despite the attractions of Finnish, he still carried a candle for Edith. In fact, it still burned brightly. Immediately on turning 21, he wrote to her, only to learn that she was now engaged to another man. But rather than give up, he caught the train and in the course of one afternoon's conversation, talked her out of it. He could already weave a spell with words. He could not silver-tongue his way to success in his exams, however. What with dining clubs and rugby, Finnish and Edith, he simply hadn't done the work. He would have failed completely except for a stellar paper on Greek philology. Still, the path ahead, 2 more years of Latin and Greek, looked dull, daunting, and very likely disastrous, with the odds stacked against getting a decent classics degree. So Tolkien saved himself by changing courses in midstream. He'd just discovered that Oxford had an English degree course. Such things are common today, but at that time they were a very new idea. Oxford's English course would allow him to go all out philological, focusing on Old and Middle English, Old Norse, Gothic, all of which he had been studying in his spare time since school days. Besides learning about these languages and their evolution from a lost Germanic parent language, Tolkien became fascinated by another aspect of philology, studying the interrelated fragments of myth, legend, and fairy tale that had survived into the written record in these languages. and then trying to reconstruct the lost stories that might lie behind them. But besides philology, there was a second vital catalyst for the sudden blooming of Tolkien's imagination. War broke out in summer of 1914, and Britain joined after its ally Belgium was invaded by Germany. Most of his friends quickly answered the call to join Britain's armed forces almost immediately, but Tolkien decided he must first complete his degree in Oxford. Like a thunderclap, sudden war shakes us from our beds. War makes the world strange and breeds horrors and heroes. Tolkien said later that for him, a real taste for fairy stories, and he might have added myth and legend, was wakened by philology on the threshold of manhood and quickened to full life by war. In a poem written within weeks of the outbreak of war, Tolkien invented his first hero, Eärendil, and imaginatively reconstructed a myth in which he is a mariner who sails off the edge of the world and becomes the evening star. Meanwhile, Tolkien had been tinkering with a new invented language, Quenya, inspired this time not by Greek or Gothic, but by Finnish. And he had also been trying to adapt a story from the Kalevala, Finland's epic mythological poem. Compiled in the 19th century from old folk songs, the Kalevala was part of a worldwide movement to use myth, legend, and folklore as foundations for national identity. Tolkien soon gave up on his adapted story, but only because he'd had a better idea. He would imagine what kind of a mythology England itself might have had but did not. Something to match the mythologies of the Finns, the Scandinavians, the Celts, and the Greeks. His English mythology would be the home for his newly invented Quenya language and of its speakers, the elves. The names in Quenya and his other invented languages would provide the authentic Middle-earth flavour, helping to transform whatever Tolkien stirred into the mix, philology, myth, fairy story, or even references to his personal life and to contemporary events. Suddenly in 1915, he was writing a profusion of mythological poems, continuing after he achieved a first-class Oxford degree and during a year's army training in England as a second lieutenant, the lowest rank of officer, specialising in signals. The three friends now left in the TCBS, Christopher Wiseman, Robert Quilter Gilson, and Geoffrey Bache Smith, were his enthusiastic readers, and in stirring the ferment of ideas, his collaborators too. In the face of war, the TCBS began to believe they had jointly been granted some spark of fire, as Tolkien put it, that was destined to kindle a new light. Tolkien's elves are immortal, supernaturally skilled and sanctified by living alongside the guardian angels, or Valar. In his earliest ideas, the elves would leave their fortunate land in the far west to bring enlightenment to mortal folk living in Europe, and would ultimately settle in the lonely isle, Britain itself. Considering this was meant to be a lost mythology of pre-Christian England, this was remarkably pious, as if the elves were missionaries of a sort. It was also quasi-autobiographical, with places of personal significance to Tolkien, notably Oxford and Edith's hometown of Warwick, featuring as ancient elven settlements. Even Tolkien and Edith themselves had their mythic counterparts, who are members of the Valar. The couple married in March 1916, and Edith moved to be near Tolkien's army camp. But within weeks, his orders came to proceed to the Western Front in France. Parting from her was like a death, he said. The war killed 1 in 5 junior British Army officers. Tolkien survived for several reasons. His battalion, the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers, was in reserve on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, when nearly 30,000 British soldiers were killed as they tried to advance against German machine guns and artillery. Then, though he was in and out of the trenches for 3 months, his duties as battalion signals officer meant he was not sent over the top in patrols or attacks. Finally, he was sent back to England in October to grapple with viral trench fever, with the animal horror he had witnessed in the trenches, his words. And with the deaths of R.Q. Gilson and later G.B. Smith, half of the TCBS, it would have been understandable if Tolkien had suffered shell shock, what today we call post-traumatic stress disorder. Instead, he channeled fierce energy and deep emotion into writing The Book of Lost Tales, mostly composed between army duties in England during repeated stays in hospital or convalescence. Now he reconfigured his mythology as an endless war between good and evil. A creation myth, the music of the Ainur, asks why God would create a world containing the kind of cruelty, suffering, and sorrow that Tolkien had witnessed. His story of the fall of the elves asks how a high creative culture can plunge into desperate, inescapable war. British tanks, a secret weapon first launched on the Somme, appear as the mechanical monsters in The Fall of Gondolin. His sense of the cruelties and ironies of fate provoked the tragic story of Turin, the Dragon Slayer. Conversely, his reunion with Edith and the emotional balm it brought him inspired the love story of the mortal warrior Beren and the elf princess Luthien Tinuviel, who, in the earliest version, do battle with a monstrous cat. Mingling irony and sorrow with joy, enchantment, and even comedy, Tolkien avoided the despairing disenchantment of classic trench literature. But after the war ended in 1918, Tolkien's focus shifted to family and career. He settled with Edith and their one-year-old son John in Oxford, researching Germanic word origins for the multi-volume Oxford English Dictionary. His first published book was A Middle English Vocabulary, a glossary to accompany a collection of 14th century texts for students. As a second son, Michael, was born, Tolkien was appointed to lecture in the English faculty of Leeds University in the north of England. With colleague Eric Valentine Gordon, Tolkien produced a landmark edition of the Middle English alliterative poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. They popularised the Leeds English course by setting up a Viking club to read Icelandic sagas in Old Norse. In 1924, just before the birth of a third son, Christopher, Leeds created a professorship for Tolkien, but a year later he was appointed Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford. There he created another saga reading club, the Kolbitar, or Coalbiters, a word for the unpromising, self-indulgent youths who so often end up as the surprise heroes in Icelandic literature, kind of like proto-Frodos. Into the Coalbiters he brought C.S. Lewis, not yet the famous lay theologian or creator of Narnia, but for now just a colleague in the Oxford English faculty. Lewis's first impressions of Tolkien were not promising. No harm in him, only needs a smack or so. But in a way this was spot on. Sometimes Tolkien did need a good whack, and metaphorically speaking, to push him to his potential. He could only work on his mythology, or its languages, just as vital to him, between university teaching, lecturing, and admin, and between numerous scholarly projects too. The Book of Lost Tales had long ago lost all impetus. Feeling its inadequacies, instead Tolkien had begun retelling the story of Turin Turambar in alliterative verse. Then he had abandoned that to begin retelling the story of Beren and Luthien in rhyming couplets, which in turn was never completed. You see a pattern here? By the end of the 1920s, Lewis and Tolkien were allies and friends. Finally, Tolkien showed him the Beren and Luthien poem, and Lewis was wonderstruck. Spurred no doubt by this encouragement, Tolkien now produced the first proper version of the Silmarillion, the whole mythology reconfigured as a continuous chronicle and retold in an elevated style of English. Many of the direct connections with England and autobiographical elements were here removed. Lewis would remain the principal adult audience and chief motivator for Tolkien's mythology for a decade. There's no debate over Tolkien's influence on Lewis. It was a conversation with Tolkien that brought the formerly atheist Lewis to full Christian belief. There is debate over Lewis's influence on Tolkien. Lewis himself once proclaimed, "No one ever influenced Tolkien. You might as well try to influence a Bandersnatch." But the influence of close friends and regular conversation is not always obvious or easily measured. There are shared influences, but the influence of close friends and regular conversation is not always obvious or easily measured. There are shared interests and development. There is the drip of water on stone. There is the slow action of warmth and sunlight that can spur growth. Above all, Tolkien enjoyed entertaining an audience, and Lewis was a maestro at applause. Only from him, Tolkien wrote, did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. Without Lewis, it is doubtful that Middle-earth would ever have escaped the crushing planetary pull of Tolkien's self-critical perfectionism and reached the public eye. It was The Hobbit that did it. This story began when Tolkien was marking exams, tedious but financially necessary work that swallowed much of his spare time. In the depths of boredom, he doodled a characteristic bit of nonsense. In a hole in the ground lived a hobbit, having as yet no idea what a hobbit was. By the end of 1929, he was telling Bilbo Baggins's story to his 3 boys, his newborn daughter Priscilla still being too young. He had told many stories to them, but with this one he stumbled on a truly fruitful idea. Aside from his small stature, Bilbo was a comic type familiar to the boys, essentially modern, rather smug and spoilt, but a likeable homebody. But Tolkien catapulted Bilbo out of his cosy home into the wider, wilder, older world of the Silmarillion. This juxtaposition was a new way to mix Englishness and mythology, and also to mix humour and seriousness. Bilbo is laughable, but gradually reveals hidden depths of resourcefulness and courage. On a journey of a length sufficient to provide the untoward in any degree from discomfort to fear, Tolkien once said, the changing companions well known in ordinary life and in oneself is often startling. Behind this observation lay the memories of long, often uncomfortable and sometimes terrifying journeys in the Swiss Alps and the trenches of the First World War. In his mythology so far, all the heroes had gone through perilous journeys that changed them, but they were larger than life from the get-go. None of them could possibly go through a transformation as startling as little Bilbo's. And since Tolkien himself was an essentially modern, rather smug and spoilt but likeable homebody, through Bilbo he had hit upon a way to channel his own experience better than ever before. Actually, Tolkien didn't have to travel all that far for discomfort, fear and transformation. In early 1936, he was stretching for a high ball while playing squash when he felt a sharp pain in the leg. Thinking his partner had kicked him, he said, "Don't do that again, it hurts." In fact, he had torn a ligament that meant 10 weeks in bed. Of all the men I have ever met, C.S. Lewis's brother observed, Tolkien is the most unfortunate. The silver lining was that the injury spared Tolkien from much of his usual university work. Together with a timely inheritance to shore up the family finances, this was probably crucial in making 1936 a pivotal year. The break gave him time to prepare a landmark lecture for the British Academy, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. Celebrating the Old English poem Beowulf as a work of literary art rather than just a mine for historical and philological study, the lecture permanently changed attitudes towards Beowulf. Meanwhile, Tolkien also poured new energy into his mythology and his languages. And one day, a former student, visiting on behalf of the London publisher George Allen and Unwin to discuss an academic project, borrowed the manuscript of The Hobbit. The publisher's 10-year-old son, Rayner Unwin, devoured it. A publishing contract was signed that November. Now this got Tolkien puzzling over various problems arising from the rather casual way he had planted The Hobbit in the world of the Silmarillion. What had happened between the defeat of the great enemy Morgoth in the Silmarillion and the rise of Mr. Baggins? How had the necromancer, Morgoth's servant, come to be living in Mirkwood in The Hobbit? How could Tolkien dovetail his myth of a flat earth dominated by elves with our own globe dominated by mortal men? In a eureka moment, he conceived the story of the fall of Numenor, a Middle-earth version of the classical fable of Atlantis. It resolved all the problems that had been puzzling Tolkien. It also allowed him to express his mounting alarm about the increasingly dire political situation in the real world. Murderous totalitarian regimes were in power in Germany, Russia, and elsewhere. So whereas the necromancer had been a vampiric lord of werewolves in the Silmarillion, in Numenor he becomes the hidden power who corrupts the kingdom and turns the king into a tyrant. These burning topical concerns with denunciations, torture, and disappearances are especially clear in The Lost Road, a novel about time travel back to Numenor, which Tolkien began after a pact with Lewis to write science fiction. When at this time my father reached back to that world, Christopher Tolkien commented much later, he found there an image of what he most condemned and feared in his own. The Hobbit, published in September 1937, changed Tolkien's life. At last, the doorway to Middle-earth was open, and 2 decades of writing had not been in vain. His publisher was eager for more by Tolkien, so he offered The Lost Road, the long Beren and Luthien poem, and a new version of the Silmarillion, which he was now rewriting again. But the publisher sent back the manuscripts and told Tolkien that what his readers really wanted was more from you about hobbits. Exasperated and bitterly disappointed, Tolkien told a correspondent, I offered my publisher something grand, a complete and heroic history of the elves, and they clamour for more hobbits. But he wrote back to his publisher defeated, asking rhetorically and plaintively, what more can hobbits do? He was all out of ideas. He also had laryngitis and severe conjunctivitis and could hardly see. Yet, with irritation and deep reluctance, the next day he shelved both the Numenor time travel story and the Silmarillion to embark on a new Hobbit, a story that, as yet, had no destination. The Lord of the Rings is a masterpiece known and loved worldwide, but that was far from inevitable. At first, Tolkien simply ambled forwards, throwing in old ideas like Tom Bombadil, a character from a 1920s poem, but puzzling over the one intriguing leftover from The Hobbit, Bilbo's magic ring of invisibility. Step by step, he connected the ring with Sauron, the necromancer, and his war with the mortal exiles of ruined Numenor, bringing in the elves, older and wiser than in the Silmarillion. He enriched the story with ideas that he distilled in a 1939 talk on fairy stories, a lecture that can be read now as a kind of manifesto for The Lord of the Rings. The keen interest of C.S. Lewis and Christopher Tolkien, off school with heart trouble for nearly 3 years at this point, spurred him to write more and write better. So, as he famously recalled, this tale grew in the telling. From the outset, the new Hobbit gave a closer, more detailed view of Middle-earth than the old one. Quickly, it also became deeper and darker. Tolkien admitted to his publisher that although it was not an allegory to be decoded for its topical message, the darkness of the present days has had some effect on it. At the time he said this, Spain was tearing itself apart in civil war between right and left. In Soviet Russia, Joseph Stalin was criminalizing or killing supposed internal enemies in their millions. Adolf Hitler had already annexed Austria, and now Britain and France had effectively handed him part of Czechoslovakia in the hope that this would appease Nazi Germany's ethno-national ambitions. The appeasement failed and war came a year later, in September 1939. Tolkien agreed to work in government code breaking, but was not needed. Instead, while many colleagues went off to fight, he bore the brunt of running the depleted Oxford English faculty. He taught short courses in English for military cadets, and with Lewis devised exams for Allied prisoners of war in Germany and Italy. He also volunteered as an air raid warden, helping to enforce the nighttime blackout of all lights to protect the city from German bombing raids. Against this background of strain, The Lord of the Rings could only grow in fits and starts, reaching Moria by the end of 1939 and Rohan in 1942. Here, More than anywhere else, Tolkien's scholarly expertise took charge as he created a culture closely based on the Anglo-Saxons and their poem Beowulf. But at the same time, the shifting alliances and treacheries of the real war were reflected in the invention of the renegade wizard Saruman. Tolkien read each successive chapter to the Inklings, the circle of friends and writers who met weekly in C.S. Lewis's college rooms or in the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford. But then Tolkien ploughed into the doldrums. A short story, Leaf by Niggle, also written in 1942, imagines a painter who cannot complete his ever-growing painting of a marvellous tree. The story expresses Tolkien's acute anxiety, grounded in recognition of all he had failed to achieve in a quarter century of writing, that he would never finish his new story, or for that matter, the Silmarillion. Personal fears crowded in too. His sons had now reached the age of military service. In 1944, Christopher was sent to South Africa to train as a Spitfire pilot. By that time, Michael had already served as an anti-aircraft gunner and then as a rear gunner in bombers over Germany, and he had now been declared medically unfit, so that even after the war he was, in his father's words, still virtually a shell shock case. But writing to faraway Christopher in 1944 gave Tolkien added incentive to push ahead with The Lord of the Rings. With encouragement from Lewis, fresh inspiration propelled Tolkien forward with the story of Frodo and Sam's journey to the passes of Mordor. Letters to Christopher show Tolkien ruminating about his own military service in the previous war, and these chapters of The Lord of the Rings are marked by memories of it too. The dead marshes and the poisoned wasteland of Dagorlad recall the Somme landscape. Faramir, a scholar at war, embodies aspects of young J.R.R. Tolkien himself. Sam Gamgee was a conscious reflection of the uneducated, working-class men whom Tolkien had fought alongside, ordinary yet extraordinary. Frodo Baggins shows increasing signs of psychological troubles that closely mirror post-traumatic stress disorder, and Gollum has already gone far down that road. Even though Tolkien's wartime duties tailed off, professional and creative distractions kept Tolkien from completing The Lord of the Rings. Just after Hitler's defeat and the end of the war in Europe, in 1945, he was appointed Professor of English Language and Literature at Merton College, Oxford. A few months after the defeat of Japan, he reworked his myth about the music of creation, as well as his central Numenor legend. He invented a new language, Adonaic, for Numenor, and he made another attempt at a Numenorian time travel novel, The Notion Club Papers, this time involving a group of Oxford academics very much like the Inklings. For years, Tolkien had been assuring his long-suffering publisher that it was getting towards the end of The Lord of the Rings, but every time the story had taken charge, continuing to grow in scope. Even having brought Frodo to the brink of Mordor at the end of Book 4 in 1945, he still thought that there was only one further book to write. As it turned out, it took 2 further books to tell the whole story. It was not until 1948 that he finally reached the Grey Havens and the end of Book 6. Then he had to type and revise the whole thing, nearly 500,000 words, and write the appendices. By now, Allen and Unwin needed something else to publish and brought out the entirely unrelated Farmer Giles of Ham, set in a medieval Oxfordshire and parodying the cheap chapbooks that had been a popular conduit for hero stories in the early centuries of print. Tolkien recommended its illustrator, Pauline Baynes, to C.S. Lewis for his new Narnia books. This was the year that a young Hobbit fan, Hugh Brogan, saw Tolkien perform his greatest party trick, a feat of acrobatics that has not yet made it into any book. Brogan, in his later life as a distinguished historian, told me how in 1949 Tolkien visited the Brogan family home, which had an elegant winding staircase. He went up to the first floor landing and fell all the way down quite spectacularly, about a dozen steps, arms and legs splaying about in all directions, and an immense clatter. Then he stood up none the worse for wear. "We were literally breathtaken," said Brogan. It's not a bad metaphor for a life spent bouncing back from mishaps and disasters. The Lord of the Rings itself nearly crashed into catastrophe at the 11th hour. Tolkien had decided to switch to a new publisher, Collins, unwisely believing that they might be able simultaneously to publish the Silmarillion, which he was now energetically enlarging and revising yet again. But when discussions with the new publisher collapsed, Tolkien went apologetically back to Allen and Unwin. They thought The Lord of the Rings alone quite enough of a gamble, but brought it out in 3 volumes between 1954 and 55. It had taken 18 years. Tolkien saw 2 significant books to publication in the 1960s: The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, a collection of Middle-earth verse, and Smith of Wootton Major, an unrelated standalone story of an English wanderer in Faerie. But he never finished the Silmarillion. Why not? First, when his prospective publication deal with Collins collapsed in 1952, so did an amazingly productive 3-year burst of work. He had been extensively revising and enlarging the Silmarillion and the Lay of Leithian, the Beren and Luthien poem. He had begun ambitious, expanded retellings of the fall of Gondolin and the story of Turin. All this was fueled by a sense that publication could be just round the corner, and that it must be soon or no one would understand The Lord of the Rings. Now all that had changed. Fans wanted the Silmarillion, and therefore so did Allen and Unwin, but all sense of a deadline steadily slipped away. As with The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion could take as long as it needed. But it was a bigger problem than The Lord of the Rings, because Tolkien effectively had started the Silmarillion 6 times since 1917, only producing 1 complete version back in 1930. Later, more ambitious expansions were interrupted or had petered out partway through. Style, names, details, underlying motives had all been altered, and Tolkien, in his changefulness and perfectionism, might alter any of these things yet again. Everything needed not just completing, but harmonizing. He was adrift in a sea of conflicting manuscripts and could not steer a steady course. Besides anxiety about consistency, there was a more basic fear. Could the Silmarillion really satisfy the audience of The Lord of the Rings, when it was so much more remote and so devoid of hobbits? And his new audience could not help him like his old audience had. His son Christopher was now married and beginning his own Oxford University career. Friendship with C.S. Lewis had grown remote and rather strained. The two had devoured The Lord of the Rings chapter by chapter as it was written. No one did that with Silmarillion. Instead, Tolkien was answering letters from strangers avid for information about Middle-earth in all its many facets: maps, geology, languages, music, botany, history, and more. Progress on the Silmarillion was further undermined by fear that its readers simply could not accept a fully fledged myth of the kind Tolkien had long conceived. In the months after Hiroshima, he began experimenting with a revised cosmology in which the world of Middle-earth had always been a globe, a radical break with the more poetic, flat Earth ideas of his youth. The year after the launch of the first space satellite, Sputnik, he was still inclined to scrap the whole idea of the flat Earth, and as he put it, the astronomically absurd business of the making of the sun and moon. He commented, "When it is the general belief that we live on a spherical island in space, you cannot do this anymore." Tolkien's sense of enchantment and wonder had survived the First World War trenches intact, but it seems that now, in the atomic era and the space age, disenchantment had finally caught up with him. Tolkien's authorized biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, guessed that he could not contemplate the thought of having no more creating to do inside his invented world. That's evident nonsense, because Tolkien did keep creating. It's just that he was now pouring more of his energy into reconstructing more rationally acceptable versions of his earlier myths, or indeed working on anything other than the Silmarillion itself. In particular, his urge to tell a story and to capture the enchantment he had felt in his youth had largely faded and been replaced by an urge to explore philosophical, cosmological, and anthropological matters. the deep science of the elves and their thought. Ultimately, perhaps, Tolkien's failure to finish the Silmarillion came down to simple numbers. The Lord of the Rings had taken 18 years when Tolkien was in the prime of his mature creative life. From 1955, when the third volume was published, Tolkien actually had only 18 years left to live, had he but known it. Well, before the end, his energies, focus, and memory were simply not up to the job. He suffered endless interruptions from fans, journalists, and others. He had to look after Edith, who was often unwell, and he had his own health problems to weather too. In 1968, they left Oxford to get more privacy in a house on the south coast of England. Preparing to move, Tolkien was running down the stairs, still perhaps imagining himself invincible on them, but fell and injured his leg badly. He was still in hospital when the removal company packed up his belongings and moved them to the new house. So when he finally arrived, his papers were once again in woeful disarray. Edith died in 1971, and Tolkien moved back to Oxford, living in a flat provided by his old college, Merton. Simon Tolkien, his grandson, visited in his early teens. "I remember the sofa facing the fire," Simon once told me, "and mounds of manuscripts, a sense of frustration that he was old and that Silmarillion hadn't been published, and this sense of work uncompleted." But Simon added, he seemed to enjoy life, and I think he enjoyed enormously being back in Oxford. J.R.R. Tolkien died in September 1973. On his instructions, the couple's gravestone carries the names Beren and Luthien besides his and Edith's, a testament to how he saw his own life embedded in the mythological world he had created, and to the enchantment his youthful eyes had seen in the world, despite all its calamities. Middle-earth not only outlived its author, but has grown immeasurably since his death. All this is thanks to his son Christopher, whose passion, vision, and intimate expertise finally gave us the Silmarillion in 1977, a coherent, consistent narrative pieced together out of the confused sea of manuscripts that Tolkien had left. And since the Silmarillion, Christopher has presented us with some 24 further books containing a profusion of his father's writings about Middle-earth and about other matters. Other editors have produced further volumes with Christopher's assistance and permission. Thanks in particular to the 12-volume History of Middle-earth edited by Christopher, no other author's life work has been so well served. Through these posthumous publications, we can see the growth of Tolkien's mythology from its seeds to the tips of its many branches, whether they end raggedly or in a crowning glory of leaves. But it is through biography that we can understand what soil, what sunshine, rain, and winds gave nourishment and shape to Tolkien's creative life.